Hello, thanks for watching my video. In this video, I will walk through how to consume Microsoft Teams Graph API on SharePoint Framework. My name is Santhamal Selvan and you can follow me on Twitter, AltFO. Today's session, this video is about consuming the Microsoft Teams API through Graph. Microsoft Graph API consists of several API which covers whole of the Office 365. I'm going to demonstrate how to use some of the APIs from the Microsoft Teams, especially the API which gives you how many of the teams you have joined in. And second, some basics about SPFx, which is the SharePoint Framework, and few of the tips which you can get it from development. And the third is about importing the Graph API. How do you make use of that API within SharePoint Framework? And how do you program or consume the Graph API using your JavaScript or the Typescript? And finally, all these coding which you package it through SharePoint Framework and deploy it to the SharePoint Online. The example I would take here is the SharePoint Online, which is my SharePoint Online site. Later I would show you the site and demo how to deploy and package it. And finally, how do you set up the web permission to make sure that the Graph API is being called from SharePoint Online. So let's start doing it. Okay, let's start with my SharePoint Framework. Before you start consuming your or creating your SharePoint Framework application, you need to install all the prerequisites for SharePoint Framework. You can follow the Microsoft Docs documentation to set up all the prerequisites which comes along for SharePoint Framework. So once everything is set up, then you can start creating your SharePoint Framework. To start with, I have installed it along with the PowerShell. So I always use the PowerShell to start with. Then once the project is created, I would open with Visual Studio Code and start using Visual Studio Code. Let me use the Yo Microsoft, the SharePoint command, which is the command for everyone. Let me copy that right away here. Okay, so if you see here, most of the time I would use the commands with the parameters so that there is not much of keyboard used while creating the project within the SPFx. If you see here, yo Microsoft at Microsoft/SharePoint is the standard command which most of the people uses it, and these are the parameters or the commands which you can pass through. Solution name is self-explanatory, which I mention it as MS Graph Teams. Component name, which is the web part name, you can mention any of the web part name. Usually I would end up with WP, which is a web part, and the component description is the web part description, and the component type is a web part. I'm creating a web part to be deployed to the SharePoint Online. And the framework, I'm not using any of the framework. I just use only the option without the framework. I'm not creating with React or Angular, just a plain without any framework. And the environment is about SharePoint Online, not for on-prem, NPM. And skip feature, this is like you can deploy it from the tenant level and setting it to true. When I press enter, what it does is it would start querying for SharePoint Framework, yes, and the final question which it asks for the domain, so I would set it to no, press enter. Okay, so now it has started creating the SPFx projects. Meanwhile, when the process is running, probably I'll go through the Graph API. So if you see here, I've already logged into the Graph Explorer. If some of them are not familiar with Graph Explorer, maybe you can just go to developer.microsoft.com/ the region and the Graph / Graph Explorer. So once you go into the Graph Explorer, you can log in with your Office 365 login. In my case, I've already logged in with my Office 365 ID. And once you log in with an Office 365 ID, you'll have a choice to play around with Graph Explorer. In my case, I'm going to use this API, which is my join teams. Basically, in my organization, I have joined to two of these teams. So whenever I query this using the Graph API, I would get the result as JSON, which is in this format as kind of an array. So each team detail with ID, the display name, the description, whatever the teams you have joined in, it gives you the JSON. We are going to consume this API inside the SPFx and make use of this display name to display what are the teams you have joined. So that's very simple program which we going to use and deploy within the SharePoint. Let's go back and see how far it's progressing. So it's still creating it. So by the time it ends, then we can make use of the SharePoint code. So meanwhile, I've opened my Visual Studio Code with the MS Graph Teams folder, and it is slowly creating the packages or the framework components. So it's still in progress. Probably I'll have to wait for a while to complete some of the tasks. Okay. So now it had completed the creation of the projects. So I don't need this project PowerShell anymore. And if you want to know more about it, probably if you see here, let me bring down my folders. If you see my folders, this is the folder which is created right now, and these are the components which are there. This is the folder which I've opened in Visual Studio Code, and you can see all the components which are here. This is pretty much basics. Anyone programming with SharePoint Framework will be much familiar with that. And if you see here, when you go to the SRC folder, this is the source, and you can see this is the main entry point for the web part, and this is the web part which is going to be deployed into your SharePoint. And there is one thing which I always used to do, which is in the package manager. So if you see here, these are the properties which are set for the web part, SharePoint web part, and it will be deployed to the other group if you are using the classic. And the title of the web part is msgraph-wp, and I have added already description. And if you notice, there is an Office Fabric font name. So this is the font which would appear when you search for the web part inside of SharePoint Online when you add in. So Microsoft has so many of the several icons which you can choose. You can always go to developer.microsoft.com and the Fluent UI and get most of the icons which you want to do here. I'm going to make use of this people add icon within my project so that we can just consume that icon inside. So let me add people add icon for the web part. This is optional. You don't need to do that. This is just to change the icon which is displayed when you add a web part into the SharePoint Online. The next important thing which you should do for graph consuming within the SPFx is that you need to import MS Graph client within your SPFx so that you can start making use of SharePoint or the Graph API within the SharePoint Online. So for that, maybe you just open the main Typescript file, which is the web part file, and within that you need to start using import MS Graph, which is the MS Graph client from So this is basically the Graph API is kind of a JavaScript API which is wrapped around to make it easier for you to call the MS Graph client. This is nothing but a Graph JavaScript client-side API which makes it simplified for SPFx. Remember last time when the Graph API was consumed within the SharePoint framework, you had to write so much of a line of code to just authenticate, get the key, do all those, and then finally call the API. Now they made it much more simpler. You can just include the MS Graph client within your SPFx and start using your API within. So what I'm going to do now is I'm slightly going to modify this in the render method and then call the API within. So let's do this. There is a context. Within the context, there is already a MS Graph client factory. So within that factory, there is a method called getClient. Use always the getClient. This method will make the graph call much simpler within SharePoint framework, which provisions your context for the Graph API. And once this getClient is successful, then we're going to call something like client object, which is of type MS Graph client, and this is the void method. And within that function, which means once a Graph API is called, getClient is successful, and then I'm going to make use of, let me remove this, it is giving me an error. I'm going to make use of the client object, which is a successful declaration of it. Client, within that client there is an API, so mention the API, and basically I'm going to call the get method, not the post method, and let me mention the return type, maybe any, so which returns me teams of type any, and the raw response, which can be null, and this is a method. Okay. Okay, so this is a typical Graph client API call, which you can copy paste from the Graph site as well. So if you go to any of the docs.microsoft.com Graph API call, they have the standard call, so you can just start using it. This one, just change it to any. Okay, so this is again a TypeScript format. Any is the type. So right now I don't know the type of the object return, so I just specify it as any, and the raw response I'm getting it as any type. It can be a null as well. So here the API is the one which you need to call. So for now, if you take the Graph Explorer, our API is something like join, this is the one, /me/joined teams. Let me copy that, and I would put that into my API. Okay, /me/join teams. Okay, that is the one. So probably I will move this away. Okay, so that is the API I'm going to call. So once this API is called, basically if the call is successful, If the call is successful, I'm getting the get method, and this is the place where you need to specify what is the output you should get in. So now what I'm going to do is, whatever the output which comes out is an array. So if you see the Graph Explorer, this is the Graph Explorer, you can see this is the value, and value is an array. So I could somehow judge what is the value of the object. So what I do is, I'm going to just declare one variable which is HTML. I'm going to form an HTML on my own. Then since it is an array, I'm going to just loop through an array. This is just a typical for loop. So basically this teams is the type which has a value inside. The value is an array, then based on that length I'm just going to iterate and form my own. Maybe I'll have team item which is equal to teams, which is equal to teams of j. Yeah, teams of j. Teams dot value of j. Yes, teams dot value of j. Okay, teams dot value of j. So I'm iterating to each team item. So in that, what I'm going to do is just get only the I'm going to form my own div tag for each teams. So probably team item dot display name plus div. Okay, done. So I'm forming a HTML tag for each div, and finally I'm going to use this document, this DOM element. Yes, DOM element dot inner HTML. I'm forming the HTML which is equal to probably this one. I have my okay. So what I do, okay, so this is the code which it does. What it does is it calls to the Graph API, get the JSON object or the return object, loop into an array, form a HTML tag for each of the team which I belong to, just get the display name alone. Remember, in the Graph Explorer we have the display name. So basically this is the display name which I'm going to display right away in my code, and finally I'm setting it into my output of the render method, and it would just display the team list which I'm in. So there is a header which says call to Graph API and teams list. That's it. So this is how the code works in. So my coding part is done and it is linked. So one last thing you should do is that you need to add, you just have to go to the config, break down the config folder and use the package solution, and here probably you should use skip. Okay, here probably you should use web API, which is the permission for executing the Graph API. So let me get it from my previous code and put it here. Okay, just apply this. So basically, for executing the Graph API within your code, you need these web API permission requests, and this request you will have to set it in your config file. So when you deploy your solution into your SharePoint Online, This request is automatically set into your API management level at the SharePoint administration screen. Later I would show you that, and you need to approve once to make sure that this code will execute and then give you the result which you are looking for. So basically your code is ready now. So the simple code, it's very simple code. I'm just calling the graph API, just iterating to the join teams and then setting it out. That's it. So now the code is ready. The next step in the code is to deploy, or the package the code and deploy. So for that you can run, probably I create a new terminal. Okay, so gulp package solution -ship. Let me check the versioning first before I package my solution, because I will have to. Okay, so if you see this package solution.json, there is a version field here. So every time when you package or when you want to deploy, make sure that you increment the version, or else when you deploy, every time you might have a problem deploying into your solution. So now what I do is I'm going to just package the solution, which is like packaging is gulp bundle hyphen ship. Okay, hopefully it will bundle all my code and build and package it. Okay, it has started packaging it. Okay, it is done, and I'm going to package the solution. For that I will run another command, gulp package solution, gulp package solution hyphen ship. Okay, so basically this command will create a SP package which is into the SharePoint folder. You can see it in SharePoint folder. This is the package which is created based on the parent. And when you run the bundle command inside the temp folder, you would see something which is inside the temp folder. There are certain files which are dependency files which are deployed there. So this package is ready to be deployed and to be tested. To test within the workbench, what I do is usually you would run it with no browser option. For that, let me first open the workbench within my SharePoint folder, which is here. Let me open the workbench. So if I run the workbench, it should give me this warning because it is expected. I didn't run any of the code basically inside within. So what I do is I'm going to run gulp serve hyphen no browser. I just wait for the finishing the task. Reload after 1.38 seconds. Yes, let me go here, refresh it. Okay, so now it has recognized my, if you see, basically my program. Okay, so the manifest.js first have been hit, which means it is working. So now okay, so now if you see here the MS graph WP with the people add icon, which is already been here. Okay, so that's why the icon, if you see here, this is the icon. This is my previous deployment with just the page icon. This is my current deployment. So when I click here, see what it does is it goes to the Graph API and it calls to the Graph API method, and it gets me the two teams which I have joined in. So that's how it works now. So this is a simple program which you can easily consume the Graph API and you can use it. And if you check the code here, let me stop this. Okay. So to test in the workbench, you don't really need to run the build or the package. You can just use the serve. Why I was using the build and the package is that just to show you when you run the package and the build command, what are the process it goes in. So when you run the package command, it creates the SP package, and when you build, when you run the bundle command, it creates certain dependency files under the temp folder. So only for those you can use the command. If you just want to test it within the workbench, you don't really need to run those commands. You can just say gulp serve -- no browser, then just start using the workbench. That is an option. So when you want to deploy and then test it, you really need to have either at the app level at the tenant or at the site collection level. Site collection level, if you want to deploy, you need to enable site collection level app catalog. There is a PowerShell command to execute that. So you need that PowerShell command so that you can execute that command to create to enable the app catalog within the site collection. So once that is enabled, you would see something like apps for SharePoint. So in this site collection, this is my developer site. In this site collection, I have enabled using the PowerShell command for the app catalog. So once it is enabled, you can deploy all your apps within. And remember, I mentioned about your API management, which is the API access. That has been done in the central administration, which we call it as SharePoint Admin Center. So you just go to your SharePoint Admin Center. So once you go to the SharePoint Admin Center, you just drop down the advanced API access. So inside the API access, you would see pending request and the approved request. First time when you deploy your Graph API SPFx, you would see something inside the pending request. You need to explicitly go and approve it. In my case, I already approved all three of the requests from my previous SPFx, so it is approved here. So basically, this is the code. If you go to the package.json config file, package.solution file. So basically, these are the three requests. These are the three requests which have been requested, and I approved here. So only by approving this would the Graph API will occur, and you can even deploy it into your SharePoint site just by adding the web part, and it would look like this. These are the two teams which I've been to SharePoint. So that's how about my SPFx code. Thanks for watching in. Thank you.